Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe will help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The gas lamps of Baker Street flickered with a soft, amber glow against the thickening London fog, casting long shadows that danced upon the worn cobblestones below. The autumn wind whispered through the narrowing gaps between buildings, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. Within the walls of 221B, a fire crackled in the hearth, the flames undulating in a hypnotic rhythm as they cast the sitting room in a warm, golden hue. And there, silhouetted against this gentle light, sat the unmistakable figure of Sherlock Holmes, his slender fingers steepled beneath his chin as he gazed thoughtfully at a curious envelope that had arrived with the morning post. The year was 1896, and London had begun to embrace the peculiar customs of All Hallows' Eve with growing enthusiasm. The city itself seemed to transform as October waned, as if the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had somehow thinned, allowing whispers of the unknown to seep through the veil of the commonplace. Yet, within the comfortable confines of Baker Street, such notions found little purchase in the rational mind of Sherlock Holmes. "Watson," Holmes spoke, without lifting his gaze from the fireplace, his voice a gentle rumble that seemed to blend with the crackling of the flames. "I find it most curious how otherwise sensible minds succumb to such fanciful notions at this time of year." Dr. John Watson looked up from his newspaper, the pages rustling softly as he folded it upon his lap. The evening edition had been filled with accounts of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences, stories that always seemed to multiply as October drew to its close. The warm light caught the silver strands in Watson's moustache as he smiled indulgently at his friend's observation. "It's tradition, Holmes," Watson replied, his voice carrying the comfortable weight of one who has had this conversation before. "There's something about the lengthening nights and the turning of the seasons that stirs the imagination. Surely even you must admit there's a certain atmosphere to be found in such beliefs, even if you dismiss their substance." Holmes made a soft sound, something between a chuckle and a sigh, as he reached for his pipe. The tobacco pouch made a gentle rustling sound as he opened it, the rich, earthy aroma joining the symphony of scents that filled the room. Old books and leather, beeswax polish, and the faint chemical notes of Holmes' various experiments. "Atmosphere, yes," Holmes conceded, as he carefully packed the tobacco, his movements deliberate and precise. "But it is merely an atmosphere manufactured from shadow and suggestion. The human mind, dear Watson, is remarkably adept at frightening itself with nothing more substantial than a draughty corridor or an unexpected creak upon the stair." The pipe lit with a soft glow, and Holmes drew upon it thoughtfully, sending delicate wisps of smoke curling toward the ceiling, where they danced with the shadows cast by the gaslight. Outside, the bells of St. Marylebone Church tolled the hour, their distant melodic notes filtering through the fog-dampened air of London. "And yet," Watson ventured, "there are things in this world that defy easy explanation, are there not? experiences that challenge even the most rational of minds? Holmes's eyes, sharp and perceptive, gleamed in the firelight. There are indeed mysteries, Watson, but they are mysteries of human nature, of clever deception, or of as yet undiscovered scientific principles, not of spectres and spirits that whisper through the veil between worlds. He gestured dismissively with his pipe. Halloween. All Hallows' Eve. A relic of superstition dressed in the trappings of modern entertainment. Nothing more. As if to underscore Holmes's dismissal of the supernatural, Mrs. Hudson chose that moment to enter with a tray of tea, the china cups clinking softly against their saucers. The landlady moved with practised ease, setting the tray down upon the side table with a barely audible tap. "I've brought you some of that Darjeeling you favour, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice warm and motherly, "and some ginger biscuits as well. Thought they might be welcome on such a chilly evening." Holmes inclined his head in gratitude. "Most thoughtful of you, Mrs. Hudson." The landlady straightened, smoothing her apron with a practised gesture. "I've put a small pumpkin in the hallway," she added, a touch of defiance in her tone. "Just a little nod to the season. Nothing garish, mind you." "I'm sure it's charming," Watson assured her before Holmes could offer any critique. Mrs. Hudson smiled, pleased, then glanced toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a curious spectator. "It's a proper Halloween night brewing out there," she observed, "the kind that makes you want to draw the curtains tight and keep close to the fire." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his tone neutral, yet not unkind. "Though I suspect the only spirits abroad this evening will be of the distilled variety, keeping company with revellers at the public houses." The landlady tutted softly, clearly of a different opinion, but unwilling to debate the matter. "Well, I'll leave you gentlemen for your evening. Ring if you need anything more." With that, she departed, the door closing behind her with a gentle click that seemed to seal them within their warm sanctuary against the deepening night beyond. Watson poured the tea, the amber liquid streaming into the cups with a gentle, soothing sound. Steam rose in delicate tendrils, carrying the fragrant, slightly floral aroma that seemed to enhance the cosy atmosphere of the room. He handed a cup to Holmes, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You know, Holmes," Watson mused after taking a sip of his tea, "I once encountered something in Afghanistan that I've never been able to explain satisfactorily. It was during a particularly bitter winter night, when our regiment was encamped near an ancient burial site." Holmes settled deeper into his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Watson, my dear fellow, you are a man of science, yet you possess the heart of a storyteller. It is one of your most endearing qualities." He gestured with his cup. "By all means, proceed with your tale of mystery. The night is young, and I find myself in a tolerant mood." Watson opened his mouth to begin his story when a sudden, sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, causing both men to glance up. The fire wavered momentarily, sending strange, elongated shadows dancing across the wallpaper. For just an instant, the comfortable sitting room seemed transformed into something less familiar, as if the boundary between the known and the unknown had indeed grown thin. "Did you hear that?" Watson asked, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Holmes cocked his head, listening intently. "The wind, Watson. Nothing more. Though it does sound rather like a woman's weeping, does it not? A perfect auditory illusion for a night when the imagination is already primed for the uncanny. The doctor nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. Yes, of course, just the wind. The two friends fell into a companionable silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire, and the distant sounds of London beyond their windows. The clatter of hooves upon cobblestones, the muffled calls of street vendors making their final sales of the day, the occasional shout of laughter from passers-by hurrying to their evening entertainments. Holmes had just reached for his violin, perhaps intending to fill the quiet room with gentle melody, when the doorbell rang, not the tentative ring of a casual caller, but a firm, insistent peal that suggested urgency. A client at this hour? Watson wondered aloud. Holmes set his violin aside, his expression shifting from contemplative to alert. And on such a night, he added, his earlier skepticism seemingly forgotten in the prospect of a case. Whoever it is has come some distance. There is a distinct purpose in that ring. They listened as Mrs. Hudson's footsteps traversed the hallway below, followed by the sound of the front door opening. Muffled voices drifted upward, too indistinct to make out words, but clear enough to discern. The exchange was brief and to the point. Then came footsteps upon the stairs. Not Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread, but something heavier, more purposeful. "Inspector Lestrade, if I'm not mistaken," Holmes murmured, rising to his feet just as a knock sounded upon their door. "Come in, Inspector," Holmes called, and the door swung open to reveal the familiar figure of Scotland Yard's most persistent detective. Lestrade stood upon the threshold, his overcoat damp with fog, his bowler hat clutched in his hands. His face, normally composed and professional, bore an unusual expression, a mixture of puzzlement, concern, and something that might, in a less practical man, have been described as unease. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted them with a nod. "I apologize for calling at such an hour, but I've encountered something of a peculiar nature." "No apology necessary, Lestrade," Holmes replied, gesturing toward the chair by the fire. "You appear to have walked at least part of the way here, despite the inclement weather. Whatever brings you must be of some significance." The inspector stepped inside, bringing with him the damp, cool air of London's streets. He hesitated before the offered chair, as if reluctant to fully commit to his presence. "It may be nothing," he said, his voice carrying a note of self-consciousness. "In fact, in the clear light of day, I might not have troubled you with it at all. But, given the circumstances—" "Pray, sit down," Watson urged, rising to pour another cup of tea. "Whatever it is, you'll think more clearly once you're warm and settled." Lestrade relented, lowering himself into the chair with a soft sigh. The firelight played across his features, accentuating the lines of fatigue around his eyes. He accepted the tea from Watson with a murmur of thanks, taking a fortifying sip before speaking again. "It's about an item that's come into the Yard's possession," he began, his voice steadier now. "Found during the arrest of a peddler of supposedly occult artifacts in Covent Garden. Most of his wares were the usual rubbish, crystal balls, enchanted amulets, that sort of thing. But there was one item that, well, it's caused something of a stir among my colleagues." Holmes, who had resumed his seat, leaned forward slightly, his interest visibly piqued despite his earlier dismissals of supernatural matters. "And what, pray tell, is this item that has Scotland Yard's finest so intrigued?" Lestrade reached into his coat and withdrew a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He placed it carefully on the small table between them, as if handling something delicate, or perhaps dangerous. "It's a mask," he said simply. "An old one, by all appearances. Unusual craftsmanship. But it's not the appearance that's the issue." He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. "It's what the mask does." "And what does it do, Inspector?" Holmes prompted, his tone balanced between curiosity and skepticism. Lestrade met his gaze directly. "It whispers, Mr. Holmes, or so 3 separate officers have now claimed. They say it speaks the names of those who handle it, just at the edge of hearing, like a voice carried on the faintest breath of air." A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the gentle ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece, and the soft patter of raindrops that had begun to fall against the windows. The weather had turned, as it often did in London during these late October days, from fog to a fine, misty rain that beaded upon the glass like tears. "May I?" Holmes asked, gesturing toward the package. Lestrade nodded, though his reluctance was evident in the slight tension of his shoulders. "That's why I've brought it to you. If anyone can make sense of this phenomenon, it would be you, Mr. Holmes." With careful precision, Holmes untied the string and unfolded the brown paper, revealing what lay within. Watson leaned forward in his chair, curiosity overcoming his earlier misgivings. The mask that emerged from its wrappings was, indeed, a remarkable object. Crafted from what appeared to be aged wood, darkened by time and handling, it depicted a human face of indeterminate gender, neither clearly male nor female, neither young nor old. The features were delicately carved, with high cheekbones and slightly elongated eyes that gave it an otherworldly aspect. The wood had been polished to a soft sheen, and intricate patterns had been etched along the edges, resembling ancient symbols, or perhaps merely decorative flourishes. "Interesting craftsmanship," Holmes murmured, turning the mask over in his hands, examining it from all angles with his characteristic thoroughness. "Eastern European influence, I would suggest, though with elements that suggest North African techniques as well. A curious hybrid." "But you hear nothing?" Lestrade asked, watching Holmes's face carefully. "Only the wind and rain, Inspector," Holmes replied with a small smile, "and the breathing of 3 men who have, perhaps, allowed the season to influence their expectations." Watson, however, was studying the mask with a furrowed brow. There was something about the carving that struck him as unsettling. Not frightening, precisely, but disquieting, as if the artist had captured an expression caught between emotions, a face in the process of transformation from one state to another. "What's the history of this object?" he asked, breaking the thoughtful silence that had fallen. Lestrade shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. "That's part of the puzzle," he admitted. "The peddler claims it came to him via a sailor who acquired it in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, possibly, or perhaps further east. The sailor allegedly sold it after experiencing similar phenomena to what my officers reported." "Allegedly," Holmes repeated, the word carrying all his skepticism. He continued to examine the mask, his fingers tracing the contours of the wood with scientific interest rather than apprehension. "And the peddler? Did he also claim to hear these whispers?" "He did," Lestrade confirmed. "In fact, he seemed quite eager to be rid of the thing, said it had begun to speak more frequently, and that the voices were growing clearer. He seemed genuinely relieved when we confiscated it." Holmes hummed thoughtfully, holding the mask up to catch the light. "There are small apertures here," he noted, indicating barely visible holes drilled through the nostrils and along the hairline of the carving. "Quite intentional in their placement, I suspect." His theory was interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock at the door below, followed by the sound of multiple voices. Heavy footsteps ascended the stairs, and moments later Mrs. Hudson appeared at their door, her expression a mixture of apology and annoyance. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Holmes, but there are two gentlemen insisting on speaking with Inspector Lestrade. They say it's most urgent." Lestrade rose with a sigh. "My constables, I expect. I left word at the yard where I would be." He turned to Holmes. "Would you mind terribly if they joined us? They were present when the incidents with the mask occurred. Their observations might prove useful." Holmes gestured his assent. "By all means. The more data we have, the better." Mrs. Hudson stepped aside, allowing two uniformed constables to enter the already crowded sitting room. They removed their helmets respectfully, revealing the young, earnest faces of men relatively new to their profession. Both appeared somewhat uncomfortable to find themselves in the presence of the famous detective, though the taller of the two maintained a professional composure. The shorter constable, however, could not seem to take his eyes off the mask that still rested in Holmes's hands. "Constable Wilson and Constable Parker," Lestrade introduced them. "They were on duty when the mask was brought in." The taller constable, Wilson, offered a polite nod. "Sir," he acknowledged Holmes, then turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, there's been another incident at the station. Sergeant Mills was cataloguing the evidence from today's arrests when he says he clearly heard his name called, sir, from the evidence room, when he was alone." A ripple of tension passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with greater insistence, while the wind had risen to a mournful keen that threaded its way through the chimney, creating an eerie, almost musical note that hung in the air. "Did Sergeant Mills have access to this mask?" Holmes asked, his tone remaining measured and scientific. "No, sir," the constable replied. "That's just it. The mask had already been removed by the inspector. The sergeant was nowhere near it when he heard the voice." The second constable, Parker, shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, addressing Holmes directly, "but there's something not right about that object. I heard it myself, clear as I hear you now. It called my name, just a whisper like, as if someone was standing right behind me. But when I turned—" He trailed off, his discomfort evident. "There was no one there," Holmes finished for him, his voice kind, despite the skepticism that still lingered in his eyes. "A common enough experience, Constable, especially in a profession such as yours, where alertness to one's surroundings can mean the difference between life and death. The mind plays tricks, particularly when one is tired or under stress." The young constable flushed slightly, but stood his ground. "With respect, sir, I know what I heard, and it wasn't the first time either. That thing, it seems to take a liking to certain people, follow them, in a manner of speaking." Watson, who had been observing the exchange with growing interest, leaned forward. "Follow them? What do you mean?" Parker glanced at his superior for permission to continue. At Lestrade's nod, he explained, "It's like this, sir. When the mask first came in, it was Wilkins who heard it. That's another constable at our station. Just once, his name clear as day. Then, nothing more for him. But then Wilson here, he handled it next, cataloguing it like, and after that he heard his name 3 times over the course of the day. And then, when I took over the night shift, he hesitated, as if reluctant to continue. Go on, Holmes encouraged, his attention now fully engaged. Well, sir, I heard it calling all through my shift. Sometimes faint, sometimes clear enough that I thought someone had slipped into the evidence room. By morning, I was fair jumping at shadows. I don't mind admitting. I'll now write Chapter 2 of The Adventure of the Whispering Mask with approximately 3,000 words, maintaining the sleep-inducing atmospheric style. A contemplative silence settled over the sitting room of 221B Baker Street as the young constable finished his account. The fire crackled softly in the grate, sending shadows dancing across the Victorian wallpaper in gentle, hypnotic patterns. Outside, the October rain continued its steady percussion against the window panes, occasionally punctuated by the distant rumble of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones. Holmes turned the mask over in his hands once more, his long fingers tracing the contours of the aged wood with scientific precision. In the warm glow of the gaslight, the mask's features seemed to shift subtly, as if the carved visage were breathing in time with the flickering flames. Its expression, neither smiling nor frowning, neither welcoming nor threatening, maintained that curious liminality that Watson had noted earlier, a face caught in the moment of transformation. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to his audience. He held the mask up to catch the light, examining the fine network of cracks that spiderwebbed across its surface, testament to its age and the many hands that had held it before. The craftsmanship is remarkable. I would place its origins in the late 18th century, though the style suggests techniques far older. Lestrade shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. Its age is of less concern to me than its properties, Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice carrying a note of uncharacteristic hesitation. 3 of my officers have now reported the same phenomenon. I'm not one for superstitious nonsense, as you well know, but when reliable men tell me they've heard something. Indeed, Holmes acknowledged, setting the mask down upon the side table with gentle care. And I would never dismiss the observations of experienced policemen without thorough investigation. He reached for his pipe, the familiar ritual of filling it with tobacco providing a moment of ordinary comfort amidst the growing tension in the room. Tell me, Inspector, what precisely were the circumstances of each incident? The details may prove illuminating. As Lestrade began recounting the specifics, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door once more, this time bearing a tray laden with a steaming pot of coffee and additional cups for the newcomers. The rich, earthy aroma filled the room, mingling pleasantly with the scent of Holmes' tobacco and the faint tang of wood smoke from the fire. I thought you gentlemen might appreciate something stronger than tea, given the hour and the weather, she explained, as she set the tray down. Her eyes fell upon the mask, and a small frown creased her forehead. What an unusual object. Rather unsettling, isn't it? Merely a carved piece of wood, Mrs. Hudson, Holmes assured her with a gentle smile, though one that has caused some considerable consternation among our friends from Scotland Yard. The landlady's gaze lingered on the mask for a moment longer, before she turned away with a slight shiver. Well, I'll leave you to your discussions, but if you ask me, There are some things better left undisturbed, especially on a night like this. As Mrs. Hudson departed, Watson rose to pour coffee for their guests. The liquid flowed into the cups with a soothing melodic sound, its warmth and familiar scent providing a welcome counterpoint to the increasingly strange conversation. He handed the cups around, noting the grateful nods from the two constables, whose earlier discomfort seemed somewhat allayed by this simple hospitality. Lestrade accepted his cup with a murmured thanks before resuming his account. The first incident occurred in the evidence room, as Parker mentioned. Constable Wilkins was alone, cataloguing the day's acquisitions. The mask had been placed on a shelf, along with other items confiscated from the same peddler. According to Wilkins, he had his back to the shelf when he heard his name called. Just once, but quite distinctly. Holmes nodded, drawing thoughtfully on his pipe. The smoke curled upward in delicate tendrils, adding another layer to the room's complex tapestry of scents and shadows. And the second occurrence? That would be mine, sir. Wilson spoke up, his voice steady, despite the slight tension around his eyes. I was assigned to sort through the evidence the following morning. The mask was still on the shelf where Wilkins had left it. I removed it for closer examination. Routine procedure, you understand. And at first noticed nothing unusual. It was only after I'd returned it to the shelf and continued with my other duties that I began to hear things. What sort of things, precisely? Holmes prompted, his keen gaze fixed upon the young officer. Wilson shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the recollection. My name, sir, as the others mentioned, but not immediately. It was perhaps an hour after I'd handled the mask. I was alone in the room, writing my report, when I heard someone whisper Wilson quite clearly, as if they were standing just behind me. I turned, of course, but there was no one there. He paused, taking a sip of coffee as if to fortify himself. I dismissed it as imagination at first, but then it happened again later that day, and a third time as I was preparing to leave for the evening. And in each instance you were alone? Watson inquired, his medical interest piqued. Yes, sir, or at least no one was close enough to have whispered in such a manner. The final time there were other officers in the station, but they were across the room, engaged in conversation. None of them were even looking in my direction. Holmes hummed thoughtfully, a sound that blended with the gentle patter of rain and the occasional creak of the building as it settled against the rising wind. And your experience, Constable Parker, was similar, but more frequent. The shorter constable nodded earnestly. Just as Wilson said, sir. But in my case, it began almost immediately after I took custody of the evidence room. At first, just my surname, spoken so soft I barely caught it. But as the night wore on, it became clearer, and sometimes I'd hear my given name as well. Thomas, plain as day, though no one at the station uses it. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney and causing the shadows in the room to leap and dance momentarily. In that brief flicker of movement, Watson could have sworn the mask's expression altered, a subtle shift of the carved features that suggested amusement, or perhaps anticipation. But when the light stabilized, the wooden face had resumed its enigmatic neutrality. Most interesting, Holmes murmured, his voice carrying that particular tone of intellectual engagement that Watson knew so well. And Sergeant Mills, who heard his name called in the absence of the mask, was he aware of these previous incidents? Lestrade nodded. The matter had become something of a topic at the station, I'm afraid. Difficult to keep such things quiet in close quarters. Indeed, Holmes agreed, and therein may lie our first clue. Expectation, gentlemen, is a powerful influencer of perception. Once one believes a phenomenon might occur, the mind becomes remarkably adept at interpreting ordinary sounds. The creak of floorboards, the rustle of papers, the sigh of wind through a draughty corridor, as the anticipated event. Parker frowned, clearly dissatisfied with this explanation. With respect, Mr. Holmes, I've worked night shifts at the Yard for 3 years now. I know every creak and groan of that building. What I heard wasn't the settling of old timbers or the wind in the chimney. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment. I do not dismiss your experience, Constable. I merely suggest that there are many factors at play in how we perceive the world around us, particularly in environments already charged with tension or expectation. He reached for the mask again, turning it to examine the interior. Now, as to the object itself, he fell silent, his brow furrowing as his fingers explored the inside of the mask with careful precision. After a moment, he rose and carried the artifact to his desk, where a magnifying glass lay amongst the clutter of his various scientific instruments. Holding the glass over the mask, he examined it with intense concentration, the room falling into a hush broken only by the ambient sounds of the stormy evening. "Watson," he said at last, "would you be so good as to bring the lamp closer? There's something here that requires better illumination." Watson obliged, lifting one of the oil lamps from the side table and bringing it to the desk. The increased light revealed the mask in greater detail, the fine grain of the wood, the meticulous craftsmanship of the carving, and the network of tiny holes that Holmes had noted earlier, placed strategically around the nostrils, mouth, and hairline. "Do you see?" Holmes asked, indicating the interior surface where a series of narrow channels had been carved into the wood, connecting the various openings. These are not random imperfections or damage from age. They are deliberate constructions, forming a kind of labyrinth within the wood itself. Lestrade and the constables had risen to observe this discovery, their professional curiosity momentarily overriding their unease. They crowded around the desk, peering at the mask with renewed interest. What purpose would such channels serve? Lestrade wondered aloud. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of intellectual pursuit. "That, Inspector, is the question we must answer." He turned the mask over once more, examining the exterior with equal attention. The craftsmanship suggests a highly skilled artisan, one familiar with both decorative and functional aspects of mask-making. Note the precision of these apertures. They are not merely aesthetic, but designed with specific purpose. As he spoke, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, and the flame in the lamp wavered momentarily, causing the shadows in the room to shift and dance. In that brief fluctuation of light, Watson experienced a curious optical illusion. The mask in Holmes' hands appeared to change expression, the carved lips seeming to part slightly as if drawing breath. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, but it left a lingering disquiet that settled in the pit of his stomach. "Holmes," he said quietly, "might it be prudent to conduct this examination in daylight? The hour grows late, and perhaps fresh eyes in the morning would." "Nonsense, Watson," Holmes replied with gentle amusement. "The night is still young, and we have a most intriguing puzzle before us. Besides, if our Scotland Yard friends are to be believed, this mask is most active during the evening hours. what better time to observe its supposed properties? He carried the mask back to his chair by the fire and settled into it, with the artifact resting on his lap. The warm glow of the flames danced across the wooden features, highlighting the intricate craftsmanship while casting the eye sockets into deep shadow, giving the impression of a sleeping face awaiting animation. "Now," Holmes continued, addressing Lestrade, "I would like to know more about the peddler from whom this item was confiscated. His account of how he acquired it may provide valuable context." Lestrade returned to his seat, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a small notebook. "We questioned him thoroughly, of course," he said, flipping through the pages until he found his notes. "Tobias Mercer, aged 57, known to the yard for selling supposedly enchanted or cursed items to the credulous. Most of his wares are harmless trinkets, crystal balls, pendants claiming to ward off evil, that sort of thing. He's been cautioned before, but never formally charged." "And his account of this particular item?" Holmes prompted. Lestrade consulted his notes once more. "According to Mercer, he acquired the mask approximately 3 months ago from a sailor named Jensen, who had recently returned from Eastern Europe, Bulgaria specifically. Jensen claimed to have purchased it from an elderly woman in a small coastal village who was eager to be rid of it. He brought it back to London as a curiosity, but soon began to experience unusual phenomena." "The whispers," Watson supplied. "Yes, though according to Mercer, Jensen described it somewhat differently. He said it began as a sensation of being watched, particularly when he was alone with the mask in his lodgings. Then came sounds like distant conversation, too faint to make out words. The distinct whispers of his name only started after he'd had the mask for several weeks." Holmes's fingers drummed a soft rhythm on the armrest of his chair, a habit Watson recognized as a sign of his friend's mind working through multiple possibilities simultaneously. "And Jensen sold the mask to Mercer because of these experiences?" "So Mercer claims. Said Jensen was practically giving it away, just wanted to be rid of it. Mercer, seeing an opportunity, added it to his collection of haunted curios, and began to construct a more elaborate history for it to enhance its value. Yet Mercer himself eventually came to experience the same phenomena," Holmes observed. Lestrade nodded. "According to his statement, it began much as it had for Jensen, the feeling of being observed, followed by indistinct sounds, and eventually his name being called. By the time we confiscated it, he seemed genuinely relieved to see it go." A contemplative silence fell upon the room once more, broken only by the ambient sounds of the autumn night. The steady rhythm of rain, the occasional groan of branches in the wind, the distant bells of St. Marylebone marking the passing hours. The fire had begun to burn lower, its flames less vigorous, but still casting a warm, golden glow that seemed to concentrate upon the mask in Holmes's lap. Watson found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the carved face, its features somehow more alive in the flickering light than they had any right to be. The longer he looked, the more he became aware of an odd sensation, a sort of pressure at the edges of his hearing, as if a conversation were taking place just beyond the threshold of audibility. He shook his head slightly, attributing the experience to the power of suggestion after hearing so many accounts of mysterious whispers. "I believe," Holmes said at last, breaking the silence, "that we may benefit from a simple experiment." He rose, carrying the mask to his chemical table, which stood in the corner of the room, cluttered with various scientific apparatus. If there is some property of this object that produces auditory effects, we should be able to detect it through methodical observation. He cleared a space among the beakers and test tubes, setting the mask down carefully. Then, from a drawer, he withdrew several small instruments, a thermometer, a compass, and what appeared to be a sensitive barometer. With methodical precision, he arranged these around the mask, noting their initial readings in a small notebook. The physical properties first, he explained as he worked. Any unusual electromagnetic effects, temperature variations, or air pressure, changes in proximity to the object. He glanced up at the others with a small smile. Science before superstition, gentlemen. The constables exchanged sceptical glances, but remained respectfully silent. Lestrade, more accustomed to Holmes's methods, settled back in his chair with resigned patience. Watson, however, moved closer to observe the proceedings, his medical curiosity engaged despite his lingering unease. "What are you expecting to find, Holmes?" he asked quietly. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "I am expecting to find, my dear Watson, that this mask, while undoubtedly an interesting artifact, operates according to principles entirely within the realm of natural law. No spirits, no curses, merely clever craftsmanship, and perhaps some properties of acoustics that we have yet to fully appreciate." He continued his examination, measuring and noting various aspects of the mask's construction with scientific precision. The room grew quieter as the night deepened, the sounds of London streets fading as the city settled into its nocturnal rhythms. The rain had lessened to a gentle patter, and the wind had calmed somewhat, though occasional gusts still sent moaning notes through the chimney. "Interesting," Holmes murmured after some time, his attention focused on a particular area of the mask's interior. "Watson, observe these channels more closely. Note how they converge here, behind the mouth, creating what appears to be a kind of resonance chamber." Watson leaned in, his shoulder brushing against Holmes, as they both peered at the intricate network of carved passages within the wooden artifact. "Almost like the construction of a musical instrument," he observed. "Precisely," Holmes exclaimed, his voice carrying that particular note of satisfaction that came with a promising discovery. A wooden flute or recorder channels air through carefully designed passages to produce specific tones. This mask appears to operate on a similar principle, though with considerably greater complexity. He straightened up, addressing the room at large. "Gentlemen, I believe we may be dealing with an artifact designed specifically to create auditory illusions. These channels, combined with the strategic placement of these apertures, could potentially convert air currents. Even the subtle movements of air caused by changes in temperature or the breath of nearby individuals, into sounds that mimic human whispers." Lestrade frowned, not entirely convinced. "But that wouldn't explain how it seems to know the names of those who handle it, would it? Or why Sergeant Mills heard his name when the mask wasn't even present?" "As to the latter," Holmes replied, "I would suggest that having heard accounts from his colleagues, the good sergeant's mind was primed to experience a similar phenomenon. The power of suggestion, Inspector, should never be underestimated." He turned the mask over in his hands once more. "As for how it seems to know names, that is indeed a more challenging aspect of the puzzle." He fell silent for a moment, his fingers tracing the contours of the wooden face with gentle precision. Then, almost absently, He brought the mask closer to his own face, not wearing it, but holding it near enough that his breath might pass through its apertures. A curious change came over the room in that moment, subtle, yet perceptible to all present. The quality of the silence seemed to shift, becoming somehow denser, more attentive, as if the very air were listening. The flames in the fireplace wavered slightly, though no draught had disturbed them, and the shadows they cast upon the walls appeared to deepen, gathering in the corners like attentive spectators. "Holmes," Watson said softly, a note of warning in his voice. Holmes glanced up, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Science, Watson," he reminded, gently. "Methodical observation before speculation." He returned his attention to the mask, turning it slightly to examine the interior surface once more. As he did so, a soft sound emanated from the carved face, so faint that it might have been dismissed as the creak of the wood or the sigh of the wind, yet distinct enough that all 5 men in the room froze, their attention captured completely. It was not quite a whisper, not quite a breath, but something in between, a sound that seemed to form at the very threshold of hearing, shaping itself into syllables that hovered in the air like the last notes of a dying melody. Sherlock. The name hung in the silence that followed, delicate as frost and just as chilling. Holmes himself remained perfectly still, his expression betraying nothing but scientific interest as he studied the mask in his hands. "Did you all hear that?" he asked calmly, his gaze moving from Watson to Lestrade to the 2 constables. 4 heads nodded in unison, their faces reflecting varying degrees of unease. Constable Parker had gone quite pale, while Wilson's professional composure had visibly cracked, revealing the nervous young man beneath the uniform. Even Lestrade, seasoned by years of dealing with London's darkest elements, appeared distinctly uncomfortable. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured, returning the mask to the table with careful precision. "It appears that our wooden friend has added my name to its repertoire. A phenomenon worthy of further investigation, wouldn't you agree?" Before anyone could respond, another sound emerged from the mask. Not a name this time, but a soft, sibilant exhale that might have been laughter or merely the settling of old wood. The fire chose that moment to flare briefly, sending a ripple of light across the room that made the mask's features appear to shift in a fleeting smile. I'll now write Chapter 3 of The Adventure of the Whispering Mask with approximately 3,000 words, maintaining the atmospheric sleep story style. The grandfather clock in the corner of the sitting room at 221B Baker Street chimed midnight, its deep, resonant tones rippling through the silence that had fallen over the 5 men gathered there. Outside, London had grown quieter, the sounds of carriages and pedestrians fading as the city surrendered to the late hour. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, but the wind had calmed somewhat, leaving behind an occasional melancholy moan as it found its way through the old building's many crevices. Within the warm confines of the room, the fire had burned low, its flames casting long, languid shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The gas lamps had been turned down, creating a soft amber glow that pooled around each man like a protective circle against the gathering darkness beyond. And at the center of their attention remained the mask, now resting on Holmes's chemical table, its wooden features reflecting the subtle play of light and shadow in a manner that seemed almost sentient. "Gentlemen," Holmes said at last, breaking the heavy silence that had descended following the mask's whispered utterance of his name, "I believe we have witnessed a most intriguing demonstration of the artifact's properties." His voice carried its usual composed rationality, yet there was an underlying note of genuine fascination that Watson recognized from their most perplexing cases. "You call that intriguing, Mr. Holmes?" Constable Parker responded, his voice slightly higher than normal. "That thing just spoke your name, and we all heard it, plain as day." Holmes smiled patiently. "What we heard, Constable, was a sound that our minds interpreted as my name. The distinction is subtle, but significant." He moved back to his chair, reaching for his pipe as he settled into its familiar comfort. The ritual of filling the pipe with tobacco and lighting it provided a moment of normalcy that seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. "Consider," he continued once the pipe was drawing well, sending lazy wreaths of smoke toward the ceiling, "the human mind's remarkable capacity for pattern recognition. When presented with ambiguous stimuli, be it a cloud formation that resembles a face, or a random sound that approximates speech, we instinctively organize these inputs into familiar forms." Lestrade shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. "That's all very well, Mr. Holmes, but it doesn't explain how 5 different men heard the same thing at the same moment. If it were merely our minds playing tricks, surely we'd each interpret the sound differently." "An excellent point, Inspector," Holmes acknowledged with a nod, "which suggests that while our interpretation may be subjective, the source of the sound itself is quite real and consistent." He drew thoughtfully on his pipe. "I believe we are dealing with a cleverly designed acoustic instrument, crafted to produce sounds that mimic human speech under certain conditions." Watson, who had been contemplatively silent since the mask's uncanny display, finally spoke. "But Holmes, even accepting your explanation of its mechanism, how do we account for its apparent selectivity? Why does it seem to whisper the names of those who handle it, rather than random sounds?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of a challenging intellectual puzzle. "That, my dear Watson, is the most fascinating aspect of our mystery. I have several theories, but before proposing any, I should conduct a few more observations." He rose once more, returning to the table where the mask lay. With deliberate movements, he arranged several small scientific instruments around it, a sensitive thermometer, a compass, and what appeared to be a small device of his own design, consisting of delicate metal reeds mounted on a wooden base. "This," he explained, noting Watson's curious glance at the unfamiliar apparatus, "is a rudimentary device for detecting subtle air currents. If our masked friend is indeed producing sounds through the movement of air through its internal channels, this should help us map the pattern and intensity of those currents." As Holmes busied himself with his scientific arrangements, Watson found his gaze drawn once more to the mask itself. In the subdued lighting, the carved features seemed to possess a quality of watchful patience, as if the object were quietly observing their efforts to understand it. The longer he looked, the more Watson became aware of a curious sensation, a sort of pressure at the edges of his hearing, similar to what he had experienced earlier, but more pronounced now. It was not quite a sound, but rather the anticipation of sound, like the moment before an orchestra begins to play. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a soft shower of sparks up the chimney. The sudden movement drew Watson's attention away from the mask, breaking whatever subtle spell had been building. He shook his head slightly, disturbed by how easily his mind had begun to attribute conscious qualities to what was, after all, merely a carved piece of wood. "Are you well, Doctor?" Lestrade inquired quietly, noting Watson's distracted manner. "Quite well, thank you," Watson replied with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Simply fascinated by the object, as we all are." Lestrade nodded, though his expression suggested he understood more than Watson had voiced. "It does have a way of drawing one in, doesn't it? Even knowing what we know, or perhaps what we don't know about it." Their conversation was interrupted by Holmes, who had completed his arrangements and now stood back from the table with an air of satisfied anticipation. "Now, gentlemen, let us observe what happens when we create deliberate changes in the environment around our mysterious artifact." With methodical precision, he began a series of small experiments, first lighting a candle near the mask to create rising warm air, then using a small bellows to direct gentle puffs of air toward specific apertures in the wooden face. Each action was followed by careful observation and notation in his small notebook, his scientific detachment a comforting counterpoint to the increasingly strange atmosphere of the evening. The two constables watched with a mixture of professional interest and lingering unease, while Lestrade maintained the skeptical yet open-minded attitude that characterized his most productive collaborations with Holmes. Watson, meanwhile, found himself increasingly sensitive to the subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere, the way the shadows seemed to deepen in the corners, how the familiar sounds of the building settling took on new and almost meaningful patterns, and most of all, that persistent sense of expectancy that hung in the air like the moment before a thunderclap. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured after completing several experiments. "The internal structure is even more sophisticated than I initially suspected. These channels appear to function as a kind of acoustic filter, capable of transforming ordinary environmental sounds, the crackle of the fire, our breathing, even the rain against the windows, into more structured audio patterns." "But that still doesn't explain how it produces names," Wilson pointed out, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "Patience, Constable," Holmes replied with a slight smile. "We are building our understanding piece by piece." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, would you be so kind as to stand here, beside the table, and state your full name clearly?" Lestrade complied, though with visible reluctance. "Inspector Geoffrey Lestrade," he said firmly, as if asserting his identity against some unspoken challenge. Holmes nodded, making another note in his book. "And now, if you would all maintain complete silence for precisely 2 minutes. Watson, would you be so good as to time it?" Watson dutifully checked his pocket watch as the room fell into a hush so complete that the soft patter of rain and the gentle crackle of the fire seemed suddenly magnified. Each man remained perfectly still, their breathing unconsciously synchronizing as they waited. The flames wavered slightly in the grate, sending elongated shadows dancing across the walls in slow, hypnotic patterns. In this profound silence, the subtle sounds of Baker Street at midnight became a delicate symphony. The occasional drip of water from the eaves, the distant church bells marking the quarter hour, the soft groan of wooden beams expanding and contracting with the building's heat. And beneath it all, at the very threshold of hearing, something else began to emerge, a sound so faint that it might have been dismissed as imagination, yet persistent enough to gradually command attention. It began as a sort of sibilant whisper, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. Formless at first, it gradually acquired shape and direction, becoming less random and more deliberate, as if searching for a pattern. The temperature in the room seemed to drop slightly, though the fire still burned steadily, and Watson noticed goosebumps rising on his forearms despite the warmth of his woolen jacket. Then, just as the 2 minutes were about to expire, it happened. A whisper that emerged from the mask with unmistakable clarity, quiet yet perfectly audible to all present. Geoffrey. The name hung in the air like frost, delicate yet chilling. Lestrade took an involuntary step backward, his professional composure momentarily forgotten. The two constables exchanged glances of wide-eyed confirmation, while Watson felt a peculiar sensation travel down his spine, not quite fear, but a profound unease that settled in the pit of his stomach. Only Holmes appeared unaffected, leaning forward with the intent expression of a scientist observing a particularly successful experiment. "Excellent," he murmured, making another note in his book. "Just as I suspected." "And what, pray tell, did you suspect?" Lestrade demanded, his voice carrying an edge that betrayed his discomfort. Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. "That our mysterious mask possesses properties consistent with what modern acoustic science would term selective resonance. It appears capable of filtering ambient sounds, our breathing, the fire, even the building's natural creaks and settling, and reorganizing these auditory elements into patterns that approximate human speech." "But why names?" Watson pressed, "and specifically the names of those who have handled it or stood near it?" Holmes nodded, acknowledging the central mystery. "That is indeed the most intriguing aspect. My hypothesis, and I stress it is merely a hypothesis at this stage, is that the mask somehow learns from the sounds it is exposed to. When Inspector Lestrade spoke his name clearly, he provided the mask with an auditory template, which it then reproduced using the ambient sounds available to it." Parker shook his head, clearly not satisfied with this explanation. "But I never spoke my given name in the evidence room, Mr. Holmes. No one did. Yet the mask whispered Thomas to me, clear as day." "Perhaps someone else did," Holmes suggested. "A colleague addressing you, or you signing your name in a logbook and unconsciously murmuring it to yourself. The human mind often registers and processes auditory information without our conscious awareness." The young constable frowned, considering this possibility. "I suppose it's possible, though I can't recall any such instance." A contemplative silence fell upon the room once more, broken only by the gentle symphony of midnight sounds, the rain, now falling more softly, the occasional sigh of wind around the eaves, the almost musical creak of the old building settling into the night. The fire had burned even lower, its flames now little more than a gentle glow that cast the room in soft amber light and deep velvety shadows. In this quieter, more intimate atmosphere, Watson became aware once more of that curious pressure at the edges of his hearing, a sensation not quite physical, yet not entirely imagined either. It was as if the air itself had acquired a quality of attentiveness, of patient waiting. He glanced at the mask, still resting on Holmes's chemical table, and for a brief, disconcerting moment, he could have sworn the carved eyes had shifted slightly to return his gaze. "Holmes," he said softly, breaking the silence, might I suggest a different approach? Perhaps instead of focusing on how the mask produces these sounds, we should consider why it was created in the first place. What purpose would such an artifact serve in its original context? Holmes's expression brightened with appreciation for this new avenue of inquiry. An excellent suggestion, Watson. The anthropological perspective may indeed provide valuable insights. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, you mentioned that the mask originated in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria specifically. Did your investigations yield any information about its cultural context or intended use? Lestrade consulted his notebook once more. According to the peddler's account, which, I should note, may be embellished for dramatic effect, the mask was originally used in rural Bulgarian folklore practices. Something to do with contacting the dead or communicating with spirits. The old woman who sold it to the sailor apparently warned him that it had been used in rituals to thin the veil between worlds. He closed his notebook with a somewhat embarrassed expression. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but that's the story as we received it. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, his gaze returning to the mask with renewed interest. The folklore of Eastern Europe is rich with traditions involving masks as mediators between the natural and supernatural realms. In Bulgaria particularly, there is a midwinter ritual called kukeri, in which masked dancers are believed to dispel evil spirits and bring good fortune. Watson raised an eyebrow, surprised by his friend's knowledge of such esoteric cultural practices. Holmes caught his expression and smiled slightly. A monograph on comparative folklore traditions across Europe, Watson, last winter, if you recall. Most illuminating, particularly regarding the symbolic functions of ritual objects. As he spoke, Holmes moved closer to the mask once more, studying it with a fresh perspective. This artifact, however, does not appear to be a traditional kukeri mask, which would typically feature animal motifs and more elaborate decorative elements. The craftsmanship here suggests a different tradition entirely, perhaps more aligned with divinatory practices, or, indeed, communication with the deceased. The fire chose that moment to flare briefly, sending a sudden wash of light across the room that made the mask's features seem to shift and come alive for an instant. The carved mouth appeared to curve in a subtle smile, though when the light stabilized, it had returned to its enigmatic neutrality. "Mr. Holmes," Wilson said hesitantly, "you speak of it as if it were designed to be some sort of conduit between our world and something else." Holmes turned to the young constable with a reassuring smile. "I speak of it in terms of the beliefs and intentions of its creators, Constable. As a cultural artifact, it embodies the worldview and spiritual practices of the society that produced it. Whether those beliefs have any basis in objective reality is, of course, an entirely different matter." He returned to his chair, reaching once more for his pipe, which had gone out during their experiments. The familiar ritual of relighting it provided another moment of ordinary comfort amidst the increasingly strange atmosphere. The smoke curled upward in delicate tendrils, catching the low light in a way that made it seem almost solid, like fine threads being woven into the air. "Consider," Holmes continued once the pipe was drawing well, "the fundamental human desire to communicate with what lies beyond our understanding, be it the dead, the divine, or simply the unknown. Cultures throughout history have created tools and technologies to facilitate this communication. Prayer beads, divination cards, ceremonial masks, and countless other ritual objects." Watson nodded thoughtfully. And in each case, the power attributed to these objects depends largely on the beliefs of those who use them. Precisely, Holmes agreed. The mind, Watson, that remarkable instrument, creates meaning where perhaps none inherently exists. A carved piece of wood becomes a conduit to the spirit world. A random arrangement of cards foretells the future. A coincidental sound is interpreted as a message from beyond. As if in response to these words, a curious sound emerged from the direction of the mask. Not a name this time, but a soft, sibilant whisper that might have been laughter or merely the settling of old wood. All eyes turned toward the artifact, which remained as it had been, its carved features impassive in the low light. Perhaps, Lestrade suggested, his voice carrying a note of uncharacteristic uncertainty, we might benefit from securing the object for the night. I confess, Mr. Holmes, that while your scientific explanations are most enlightening, I find myself disinclined to leave this item unattended in current circumstances. Holmes's eyes gleamed with amusement. Are you proposing we lock up our wooden friend, Inspector, for fear it might wander about at night? Lestrade flushed slightly, but stood his ground. I am merely suggesting reasonable precautions, Mr. Holmes. As you yourself have demonstrated, this object possesses unusual properties that we do not fully understand. Until we do, prudence would suggest treating it appropriately. Respect. A moment of silence followed this statement, broken only by the soft patter of rain and the gentle crackle of the fire. Outside, the bells of St. Marylebone chimed the half-hour, their distant melodic notes filtering through the fog-dampened air of London. A sensible suggestion, Holmes conceded at last. Though I suspect our caution stems from different motivations, the practical outcome is the same. He rose and moved to a large oak cabinet that stood against the wall. From it, he withdrew a glass case normally used for displaying mineral specimens. This should serve our purpose admirably. The mask can be observed, but remains contained, satisfying both scientific interest and supernatural concerns. With careful movements, he transferred the mask from the chemical table to the glass case, closing the hinged lid securely. The artifact seemed somehow diminished by this containment, like a wild creature in captivity, its mysterious presence muted by the clear barrier that now surrounded it. There, Holmes said, stepping back to survey his handiwork. Observable, but secure. Does this arrangement meet with your approval, Inspector? Lestrade nodded, some of the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. It will do, Mr. Holmes. Thank you. As if to acknowledge this new arrangement, the fire settled lower in the grate, sending a soft shower of sparks up the chimney and casting the room in a gentler, more subdued light. The rain against the windows had lessened to a faint patter, like distant, muffled applause, and the wind had died down to occasional sighs that whispered around the eaves of Baker Street. I'll now write Chapter 4 of The Adventure of the Whispering Mask, with approximately 3,000 words, maintaining the sleep-inducing atmospheric tone. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady progression through the night, each tick merging with the gentle symphony of sounds that filled the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The rain had settled into a soft, persistent drizzle that tapped against the window panes with a soothing rhythm, like distant fingers drumming a lullaby. Outside, London had grown quieter still, the city's usual cacophony muted by the late hour and the blanketing effect of the autumn mist that had replaced the earlier fog. Within the warm confines of the room, the 5 men had fallen into a contemplative silence, each lost in his own thoughts as they regarded the glass-encased mask that now sat upon Holmes's desk. The fire had been built up once more, its flames casting a dance of light and shadow that seemed to animate the wooden features behind the transparent barrier, giving them a quality of watchful patience. Holmes was the first to break the silence, rising from his chair with a sudden energy that dispelled some of the room's growing languor. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I believe this would be an opportune moment for refreshment. A clear mind requires sustenance, particularly when confronted with puzzles of an unusual nature." The practical suggestion seemed to release some of the tension that had been building, and there was a general murmur of agreement. Watson moved to the sideboard, where a decanter of brandy and several glasses awaited. The amber liquid poured with a gentle gurgling sound, catching the firelight in a way that made it glow like liquid gold. "I'm afraid we've kept you gentlemen from your duties far longer than intended," Watson remarked as he handed glasses to Lestrade and the 2 constables. "The hour has grown quite late." Lestrade accepted the brandy with a nod of thanks. "Our shift ended some time ago, Doctor," he admitted. "I should have sent Wilson and Parker home, but—" He glanced at the glass case containing the mask. "Well, professional curiosity got the better of me, I suppose." The 2 younger men nodded in agreement, though Watson noted that neither seemed particularly eager to depart, despite the late hour. There was something compelling about the mystery they had encountered, something that tugged at the mind and stirred the imagination in a way that made ordinary concerns seem distant and unimportant. As they sipped their brandies in companionable silence, a sudden sharp knock at the street door below startled them all. The sound was unexpected in the quietude of the night, its insistent rhythm suggesting urgency. 5 heads turned toward the sitting-room door, listening as Mrs. Hudson's footsteps traversed the hallway below, followed by the creak of the front door opening. Muffled voices drifted upward, a woman's, high with anxiety, and Mrs. Hudson's, low and reassuring. Then came the sound of footsteps upon the stairs, quick and light, accompanied by the rustle of fabric and the softer tread of their landlady. Holmes set down his glass, his posture shifting subtly into the alert attentiveness that Watson recognized from countless client arrivals. "A woman," he murmured, "young, agitated, and out alone at this hour despite the weather. Something has disturbed her greatly." Before anyone could respond, a gentle knock sounded upon their door, and Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression a mixture of apology and concern. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Holmes, especially at this hour and with company present. But there's a young lady most insistent on seeing you. I told her it could wait until morning, but she's quite distressed." Behind Mrs. Hudson stood a young woman, perhaps 25 years of age, her face pale beneath the hood of a rain-dampened cloak. Her eyes, wide and dark with some powerful emotion, moved rapidly around the room, taking in the assembled company with evident surprise. I didn't realize you had guests," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of a well-educated Englishwoman, though currently strained with tension. "Perhaps I should return tomorrow." "Not at all, miss," Holmes replied, stepping forward with a reassuring gesture. "Winters," she supplied. "Sophia Winters." "Miss Winters," Holmes continued smoothly, "whatever has brought you out on such a night, at such an hour, must be a matter of some urgency. Please, come in and tell us what troubles you." The young woman hesitated, her gaze moving from Holmes to the others in the room, and then, curiously, to the glass case upon the desk. Something in her expression shifted at the sight of the mask contained within. Not recognition, precisely, but a subtle intensifying of her already considerable tension. "Is that—" she began, then seemed to recollect herself. "Forgive me, I'm not thinking clearly. It's been a most unsettling evening." Holmes guided her gently to his own chair by the fire, its warmth and proximity offering comfort to one who had clearly been out in the chill night air for some time. Mrs. Hudson, ever attentive to the needs of visitors, disappeared briefly, and returned with a steaming cup of tea, which she pressed into Miss Winters's trembling hands before withdrawing with a sympathetic murmur. The young woman sipped the tea gratefully, some colour returning to her cheeks as the warmth spread through her. Her dark hair, damp from the rain, curled in tendrils around a face that would have been quite beautiful under ordinary circumstances, but was now drawn with anxiety. "Now, Miss Winters," Holmes said, once she appeared somewhat calmer, "pray tell us what has brought you to Baker Street at this late hour. We are all at your disposal." He gestured towards the others in the room. "Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, Constables Wilson and Parker, and my colleague and friend, Dr. Watson." Miss Winters nodded acknowledgment to each in turn, her composure gradually returning as the familiar social rituals provided structure to the unusual situation. "I apologize for the intrusion, gentlemen. Under normal circumstances, I would never call upon someone unknown to me at such an hour. But these past few days have been—" She paused, seeming to search for an adequate description. "Most abnormal." "In what way?" Holmes prompted gently. She drew a deep breath, her gaze once more darting to the glass case before returning to Holmes. "It began 3 nights ago. I live with my elderly aunt in Kensington, a quiet household, very orderly, very predictable. But on Tuesday evening, something changed." Her fingers tightened around the teacup. "We began to hear things, voices, whispers, though never quite clear enough to make out words. At first, we thought it might be draughts through the old chimneys, or perhaps neighbours whose voices were carrying strangely." Watson and Lestrade exchanged glances, the similarity to their current mystery not lost on either of them. Holmes, however, maintained a neutral expression, allowing Miss Winters to continue without leading her account. "But last night the whispers changed, became more distinct. My aunt was the first to notice it. She said she heard her name called quite clearly, though no one was there. I confess I thought it might be her imagination. She is 82, and sometimes becomes confused." Miss Winters's expression clouded with guilt. "I should have taken her more seriously." "And tonight?" Holmes prompted as she fell silent. The young woman's eyes, dark with remembered fear, lifted to meet him. "Tonight I heard my own name 3 times. The last time it was so clear, so present, that I rushed into the hallway, certain someone must be in the house. But there was no one. And then—" She faltered, and Watson, recognizing the signs of someone struggling with an experience that defied rational explanation, leaned forward. "It's all right, Miss Winters. Whatever you experienced, you are among people who will not judge or dismiss your account." Gratitude flickered briefly across her face. "Thank you, Doctor. What happened next is difficult to describe. I was standing in the hallway, quite alone, when I felt a presence, as if someone or something was standing just behind me. I could feel breath on the back of my neck, cool, and not quite human. and then it whispered again, not my name this time, but an address. 221B Baker Street. Over and over, until I could think of nothing else. A heavy silence followed this revelation, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. The atmosphere in the room had changed, becoming charged with an almost electric tension that seemed to gather in the corners and pool in the shadows. "And you had never heard of this address before?" Holmes asked, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. Miss Winters shook her head. "Never. I had to ask a cabman if he knew of it. He seemed surprised that a lady would be seeking Baker Street at such an hour, but he brought me none the less." Her gaze returned to the glass case. "And now I find myself here, and you have that. Is it connected, do you think? What have I experienced?" Holmes followed her gaze to the mask, his expression thoughtful. "A most interesting question, Miss Winters. We have only recently acquired this artifact ourselves, and are in the process of investigating its unusual properties. May I ask, have you or your aunt recently purchased or been given any objects of an unusual nature, particularly items with foreign or antique origins?" The young woman frowned slightly, considering. "Not that I can recall. My aunt rarely leaves the house these days, and I am not given to impulse purchases, especially of curiosities." She paused, her frown deepening. "Although—" "Yes?" Holmes encouraged. "Last week a peddler came to the door, an older man selling what he claimed were items from Eastern Europe. My aunt has a fondness for unusual trinkets, remnants of her more adventurous youth. She purchased a small carved box from him. But surely that couldn't be related." Lestrade leaned forward, his professional interest evident. "This peddler, Miss Winters, would you happen to recall his name?" She shook her head. "I'm afraid not. He didn't introduce himself, and my aunt conducted the transaction. I merely glimpsed him from the stairs, an older man, rather dishevelled, with a weathered face and what sounded like a Cockney accent." "Mercer," Lestrade murmured to Holmes. "It must be. The timing fits." Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Miss Winters, this carved box, would it be possible for you to describe it in more detail?" "It was small, meant for jewellery, perhaps, or keepsakes, made of dark wood, with intricate patterns carved around the edges. The lid featured a face similar to—" She gestured toward the glass case. "Not identical, but reminiscent in style. My aunt placed it on the mantelpiece in the drawing-room." Holmes and Watson exchanged significant glances. The connection seemed unmistakable, yet raised more questions than it answered. How many such artifacts had the peddler Mercer distributed throughout London? And what was the true nature of their properties? "Miss Winters," Holmes said after a moment's thought, "I believe it would be most beneficial if we were to examine this box. Would your aunt be disturbed if we called upon you tomorrow morning?" The young woman's relief was palpable. "Not at all, Mr. Holmes. In fact, she would welcome any assistance. The occurrences have left her quite unsettled. We both would be most grateful." She hesitated, then added in a softer voice, "Would it be presumptuous to ask what you believe is happening? These voices, these whispers, they aren't merely tricks of the mind, are they?" Holmes rose and moved to stand before the fireplace, his tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow. "I believe, Miss Winters, that we are dealing with artifacts of unusual acoustic properties, objects designed to capture and transform environmental sounds in ways that mimic human speech. The precise mechanism requires further study, but, I assure you, there is nothing supernatural at work." His words, delivered with confident authority, seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Miss Winters visibly relaxed, her shoulders lowering and her grip on the teacup loosening. "That is comforting to hear, Mr. Holmes, though it doesn't explain how such an object would know our names, or indeed your address." "As to that," Holmes replied with a slight smile, "I suspect we may find the explanation lies more in human agency than in mysterious properties of the artifacts themselves. But let us reserve judgment until we have examined your aunt's acquisition." The rain outside had lessened to a gentle mist, and the wind had died down completely, leaving the night wrapped in a cocoon of stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves. The fire had burned lower, its flames now mere undulations of amber light that cast the room in a warm, gentle glow. In this softer illumination, even the mask in its glass case seemed less menacing, its carved features assuming a quality of patient waiting rather than watchful intent. A comfortable silence had fallen over the group when a sudden, sharp sound from the street below drew their attention. The clatter of hooves upon wet cobblestones, followed by the distinctive creak of a carriage coming to a halt. All eyes turned toward the window, though the heavy curtains prevented any view of the street. "Another visitor?" Watson wondered aloud, checking his pocket watch. "At nearly 1 in the morning?" Holmes moved to the window, drawing back the curtains slightly to peer down into the fog-shrouded street. "A hansom cab," he reported. "And yes, it appears we have another caller." As they listened, the now familiar sequence of sounds unfolded. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the front door, murmured voices, and then footsteps upon the stairs once more. But these were different from Miss Winters, heavier, masculine, yet with an uneven quality that suggested either injury or agitation. The knock, when it came, was forceful, almost desperate in its intensity. Holmes crossed to the door and opened it, revealing a man of middle years, well-dressed but in a state of considerable dishevelment. His coat was buttoned incorrectly, his cravat askew, and his hat clutched in hands that trembled visibly. His face, pale and drawn, bore the haggard look of one who has not slept in several days. "Mr. Holmes?" he inquired, his voice hoarse with strain. "Sherlock Holmes, the detective?" "I am he," Holmes confirmed. "And you are in some distress, sir. Please, come in, and tell us what brings you to Baker Street at this hour." The man stepped into the room, his gaze darting nervously around at the assembled company, before settling on Holmes with an almost desperate intensity. "My name is Edward Harrington," he said. "I am a solicitor with the firm of Harrington, Blackwood, and Mills. I would not intrude at such an hour, but I fear I am losing my mind, Mr. Holmes, and if what I have heard of your abilities is true, you may be the only one who can help me." Holmes guided the distraught man to a chair, his manner calm and reassuring. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Harrington. Whatever troubles you, I assure you we shall listen without prejudice." Harrington sank into the offered seat, his exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Watson, his medical instincts aroused, moved to pour a small glass of brandy, which he pressed into the newcomer's trembling hands. "This may help steady your nerves, sir," he suggested gently. Harrington accepted the glass with a grateful nod, taking a small sip before setting it aside. "Thank you, Doctor." "Watson," Holmes supplied, "my colleague and friend, and these are Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, Constables Wilson and Parker, and Miss Sophia Winters, who has herself just arrived with a matter of some urgency. The solicitor nodded to each in turn, though his distracted manner suggested he barely registered their presence. His gaze, like Miss Winters before him, was drawn inexorably to the glass case upon Holmes's desk, a flicker of something like recognition crossing his features. "You have one too," he whispered, half to himself. Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "One what, precisely, Mr. Harrington?" The solicitor's gaze returned to Holmes, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "A carving, like the one I purchased last week, a mask or a face, or whatever one might call it, crafted to look almost alive." Lestrade leaned forward, his professional interest evident once more. "Purchased from a peddler, perhaps, an older man with a Cockney accent." Harrington nodded vigorously. "Yes, exactly so. He came to our offices, selling what he claimed were antiquities from Eastern Europe. Most of it was clearly worthless trinkets, but there was one piece." He swallowed hard. A carved wooden figure, about 8 inches tall. A seated man, with his head tilted, as if listening. Something about it spoke to me. I purchased it. Impulse, and placed it on my desk at home. "And then," Holmes prompted, as the man fell silent. Harrington's hands twisted together in his lap, knuckles white with tension. "At first, nothing unusual. But 3 nights ago, I began to hear things. Whispers, just at the edge of hearing. I thought perhaps it was the house settling, or the wind in the chimney. But last night—" He paused, visibly steeling himself to continue. "Last night, it said my name, clearly, unmistakably. I was alone in my study, working late on a case. The carving was on my desk, as it had been for days. And suddenly, I heard Edward whisper just behind me." Miss Winters had gone very still, her face pale, as she recognized the parallels to her own experience. "Did it come 3 times?" she asked softly. "The whisper?" Harrington turned to her, startled. "Yes, 3 distinct times, each clearer than the last. How did you know?" "Because the same happened to me," she replied. "Tonight. And then it whispered an address. This address." The solicitor's expression shifted from surprise to a desperate sort of hope. "Then I'm not mad. You heard it too, and it brought you here just as it did me." A heavy silence fell upon the room, broken only by the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft patter of the rain. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension, a sense of gathering forces that seemed to press against the windows and pull in the shadows of the room. The mask in its glass case appeared to watch the proceedings with patient interest, its carved features catching the firelight in a way that suggested subtle, shifting expressions. Holmes moved to stand before the fireplace once more, his tall figure straight and composed against the gathering strangeness of the night. "Mr. Harrington, Miss Winters," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that Watson had heard so many times before. "I believe we are dealing with a connected series of events, orchestrated with deliberate intent. These artifacts, the mask we have here, Miss Winters's carved box, and your listening figure, Mr. Harrington, appear to share certain unusual properties. But, more significantly, I suspect they have been deliberately distributed as part of a larger scheme. I'll now write Chapter 5 of The Adventure of the Whispering Mask with approximately 2,500 words, maintaining the atmospheric sleep story style. The fire in the grate had diminished to a gentle glow, casting the sitting room of 221B Baker Street in soft amber light that seemed to pool around the assembled company like liquid warmth. Outside, the rain had ceased entirely, leaving behind a profound stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the distant muffled sounds of a city at rest. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passage of time with a soothing, rhythmic tick that blended with the collective breathing of the room's occupants, creating a gentle symphony of quiet existence. At the centre of attention remained the glass-encased mask upon Holmes's desk, its wooden features catching the firelight in a way that made them seem almost alive, watching, waiting, listening to the unfolding drama with patient interest. Around it had gathered an unusual assembly: the brilliant detective, his loyal friend, 3 representatives of Scotland Yard, and 2 distraught visitors, each drawn to Baker Street by the mysterious properties of similar artifacts. Holmes paced slowly before the fireplace, his tall figure moving with deliberate grace as he organized his thoughts. The others watched him with varying expressions of expectation and concern, waiting for the rational explanation that might dispel the growing unease of the night. "Let us consider what we know," Holmes began, his voice carrying that particular tone of methodical clarity that Watson had come to associate with the detective's most fascinating cases. "We have 3 artifacts of similar origin: the mask in our possession, Miss Winters's carved box, and Mr. Harrington's listening figure, all purchased from the same peddler, one Tobias Mercer, known to Scotland Yard as a seller of supposedly occult items." He paused, turning to face the assembled company with hands clasped behind his back. "Each artifact has exhibited similar properties: the production of whispered sounds that approximate human speech, specifically the names of those in proximity to the objects. And now, in the cases of Miss Winters and Mr. Harrington, these whispers have evolved to include this address, bringing both of you to Baker Street at this unusual hour." "But how, Mr. Holmes?" Harrington asked, his voice steadier now, but still carrying a note of desperate confusion. "How can carved wood speak names it should not know, or direct strangers to your doorstep?" Holmes's expression remained thoughtful as he reached for his pipe, the familiar ritual of filling it, providing a moment of ordinary comfort amidst the increasingly strange conversation. "That, Mr. Harrington, is the question we must answer, and I believe the explanation lies not in the supernatural, but in a combination of clever craftsmanship and human agency." He lit the pipe, and the sweet aroma of tobacco joined the complex tapestry of scents that filled the room: the lingering traces of rain and fog from outside, the warm wood smoke from the fire, the faint perfume of Miss Winters's lavender water, and the wool and leather of coats still damp from the night air. "Consider," Holmes continued, sending a delicate wreath of smoke toward the ceiling, "that these artifacts share certain structural features, internal channels and apertures that, as we have already demonstrated with our masked friend here, can transform ambient sounds into whisper-like utterances under specific conditions." Watson nodded, recalling their earlier experiments. "The selective resonance you mentioned." "Precisely," Holmes affirmed with an appreciative glance at his friend. "But that alone does not explain how these objects appear to know names they should not, or why they have directed 2 strangers to this address at this particular time." He moved to the desk and carefully lifted the glass case from the mask, setting it aside with gentle precision. The carved face seemed somehow more present without the barrier, its enigmatic features more immediate and compelling in the warm light. "I believe," Holmes said as he studied the mask with renewed attention, that these artifacts have been deliberately programmed, if you will, to produce specific effects at specific times, not through any supernatural means, but through careful manipulation of their acoustic properties and the expectations of those who possess them. Miss Winters frowned slightly, her delicate features reflecting both skepticism and hope. Programmed, like a music box or automaton. In a manner of speaking, Holmes replied with a nod, though with considerably greater subtlety. Observe. He lifted the mask carefully, turning it to reveal the interior surface with its network of carved channels. These passages are not random. They form a complex system designed to filter and transform sounds in very specific ways. He set the mask down and moved to his chemical table, where he retrieved a small instrument, a finely crafted tuning fork mounted on a resonant box. This device produces a pure tone at a specific frequency, he explained. Let us see how our wooden friend responds to various notes. With methodical precision, Holmes began a series of small experiments, striking the tuning fork and holding it near different areas of the mask, noting the results with scientific detachment. The room fell silent, except for the pure, crystalline tones of the fork and the soft ambient sounds of the night, the distant church bells marking the quarter hour, the occasional creak of the building settling, the gentle sigh of wind finding its way through ancient eaves. After several minutes of careful testing, Holmes straightened with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Just as I suspected," he announced. "The mask is designed to respond differently to different frequencies of sound. Certain tones activate specific channels within the wood, producing predictable patterns of air movement that we perceive as whispers." Lestrade leaned forward, his professional skepticism evident, but tempered by genuine curiosity. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes, that someone deliberately created these objects to whisper specific names when exposed to ordinary environmental sounds?" "Not just someone, Inspector," Holmes replied with a significant look. "Someone with considerable knowledge of acoustics and human psychology. Someone who distributed these artifacts with deliberate intent to specific individuals, and someone who, I strongly suspect, wished to bring those individuals to Baker Street on this particular night." A ripple of tension passed through the room as the implications of this statement settled over the assembled company. Miss Winters and Harrington exchanged uneasy glances, while Constable Parker shifted nervously in his seat. Only Watson and Lestrade maintained their composure, having witnessed Holmes's methodical dismantling of apparently supernatural phenomena many times before. "But to what purpose, Holmes?" Watson asked, giving voice to the question that hung in the air. "Why bring these strangers here? What could possibly be gained?" Holmes tapped his pipe thoughtfully against his palm, his expression distant as he followed the thread of his deductions. "Consider who has been affected, Watson. Miss Winters, living with her elderly aunt in Kensington. Mr. Harrington, a solicitor with a respected firm, and previously a sailor recently returned from abroad and a peddler of curiosities. What connects these individuals?" The room fell silent as each person considered the question. It was Miss Winters who broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Nothing obvious, Mr. Holmes. I've never met Mr. Harrington before tonight, nor do I recall any connection to sailors or peddlers beyond the man who sold my aunt the carved box." "Precisely," Holmes said with a nod of approval. "No obvious connection. Yet you have both been directed to this address on this night, through similar means, which suggests a test, Watson supplied, following his friend's reasoning. Someone is testing the effectiveness of these artifacts as a means of influencing behavior. Holmes' expression brightened. Excellent, Watson. Yes, a test, or perhaps a demonstration. And if I am not mistaken, we may expect more visitors before the night is through. As if summoned by his words, the sound of carriage wheels upon wet cobblestones drifted up from the street below, followed by the familiar sequence of events. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the front door, murmured voices, and then the tread of someone ascending the stairs. This time the step was firm and measured, suggesting neither the anxiety of Miss Winters nor the agitation of Mr. Harrington. The knock, when it came, was equally deliberate. 3 precise taps that spoke of confidence rather than desperation. Holmes crossed to the door and opened it, revealing a tall, distinguished gentleman of late middle age, impeccably dressed despite the late hour. His silver hair and beard were trimmed with military precision, and his bearing suggested a man accustomed to command. Professor James Moriarty, he introduced himself with a slight bow. I believe you may be expecting me, Mr. Holmes, though we have not had the pleasure of meeting before this evening. A profound silence fell over the room, so complete that the soft patter of rain resuming against the windows seemed almost thunderous by comparison. Holmes stood perfectly still in the doorway, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts as he studied the newcomer with intense focus. Professor, he acknowledged at last, stepping aside to allow the man entry. Indeed, your arrival completes a most interesting pattern. Please, join us. Moriarty stepped into the room, his keen gaze taking in the assembled company and the glass-encased mask upon the desk with evident satisfaction. I see my little acoustic experiments have performed as intended, he remarked, his voice carrying the refined accent of an educated Englishman, with a subtle undercurrent of something else. Perhaps amusement, perhaps pride. Your experiments, Professor? Holmes inquired, his tone neutral, yet alert. Moriarty moved further into the room, seemingly untroubled by the surprised and somewhat suspicious gazes fixed upon him. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, the mask, the box, the listening figure, all products of my research into what might be termed acoustic influence. Clever applications of resonant frequencies and suggestive auditory patterning that the human mind naturally interprets as meaningful communication. He gestured toward Miss Winters and Harrington with a courteous nod. I must thank you both for your unwitting participation in my field tests. Your presence here tonight confirms the effectiveness of the methodology. Lestrade had risen to his feet, his professional instincts clearly aroused by this casual admission. Field tests. Do you mean to say, Professor, that you deliberately caused these people distress as part of some experiment? Moriarty turned to the inspector with a placating gesture. No lasting harm was intended or inflicted, Inspector. Merely a temporary state of uncertainty that led them to seek explanations, specifically to seek them here at Baker Street, where I knew Mr. Holmes would apply his considerable intellect to unravelling the puzzle. He turned back to Holmes with an expression of genuine respect. You see, Mr. Holmes, I have followed your career with great interest. Your monograph on the tracing of footprints, your treatise on the different types of tobacco ash, remarkable works. I wish to observe your methods first-hand, particularly when confronted with phenomena deliberately designed to suggest supernatural origins. The room had grown very still as this explanation unfolded, each person processing the implications in their own way. Miss Winters appeared caught between indignation and relief, while Harrington simply looked exhausted, the tension of the past days giving way to a profound weariness now that an explanation, however unusual, had been provided. Holmes studied Moriarty with undiminished intensity, his expression thoughtful. "A most elaborate scheme, Professor, merely to observe my methods. One might think a simple consultation during ordinary hours would have sufficed." Moriarty smiled slightly, an expression that did not quite reach his eyes. Perhaps. But would it have provided the same quality of observation? To see the great Sherlock Holmes confronted with apparently inexplicable phenomena, watching as he methodically strips away mystery to reveal the rational mechanisms beneath, that requires a certain theatricality. He moved to the desk where the mask lay exposed, studying it with evident pride. These artifacts represent years of research into acoustic properties and psychological response. The internal channels are carefully calibrated to transform ambient sounds, breathing, the crackle of a fire, even the subtle movements of air currents in a room, into patterns that the human mind naturally interprets as whispered speech. But the names, Watson pressed, still not entirely convinced. How could these objects know the names of those who possessed them? Moriarty turned to him with an appreciative nod. "An excellent question, Doctor. They didn't, of course. Not initially. The first whispers are deliberately ambiguous, sound patterns that the mind struggles to interpret. In that struggle, the subconscious often supplies what it fears or expects to hear, commonly one's own name. Once that association is established, the mind becomes remarkably adept at filtering subsequent sounds to match the expected pattern." He gestured toward Holmes's experiments with the tuning fork. "As Mr. Holmes has already demonstrated, different frequencies activate different channels within the artifacts. By carefully observing which frequencies were most common in various environments, the tick of a particular clock, the dominant note of a voice, the resonant frequency of a room, I could design artifacts that would respond with increasing specificity over time." "And the address, 221B Baker Street?" Miss Winters asked, her voice carrying a mixture of fascination and lingering resentment. "You somehow programmed that into the carvings as well?" Moriarty nodded. "A more deliberate application of the same principle. Once the artifacts had established their influence through the whispered names, introducing a new pattern, one specifically designed to replicate the cadence and sound of an address, was relatively straightforward. The human mind, having accepted the first phenomenon as real, readily embraces the second." Holmes had been listening to this explanation with growing interest, his initial suspicion giving way to professional curiosity. "A most ingenious application of acoustic principles, Professor. Though I must agree with Inspector Lestrade that the distress caused to your unwitting subjects was, perhaps, unnecessary." Moriarty inclined his head in acknowledgment. "A fair criticism, though I would argue that the temporary discomfort has been balanced by the satisfaction of complete explanation. Miss Winters and Mr. Harrington now understand the true nature of their experiences, which should prove considerably more comforting than lingering uncertainty." He turned to address the two directly. "You have my sincere apologies for any distress caused. The artifacts in your possession are yours to keep or dispose of as you wish. though I would, suggest that, with the mystery solved, they may now be appreciated simply as unusual examples of acoustic craftsmanship, rather than objects of unease. I'll now write Chapter 6 of The Adventure of the Whispering Mask, with approximately 2,500 words, maintaining the atmospheric sleep story style. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the sitting room of 221B Baker Street in a soft, dreamlike illumination that blurred the edges of objects and deepened the shadows in the corners. Outside, the rain had ceased entirely, leaving behind a profound stillness punctuated only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the distant, melancholy call of a night bird. The hour had grown very late indeed, well past 2 in the morning, according to the grandfather clock, whose steady ticking provided a soothing rhythm beneath the conversation. Professor Moriarty had settled into a chair near the fire, his distinguished figure appearing at ease despite the unusual circumstances, and the somewhat sceptical gazes still fixed upon him. Miss Winters and Mr. Harrington had visibly relaxed as the rational explanation for their experiences unfolded, the haunted expressions giving way to tired relief as the mystery dissolved into science and deliberate human agency. Holmes stood by the mantelpiece, his tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the embers. He had been listening to Moriarty's explanations with growing interest, his initial wariness gradually transforming into professional appreciation for the ingenuity involved, regardless of the questionable ethics of the experiment. "You mentioned years of research, Professor," he said, breaking a brief silence that had fallen over the room. "What led you to this particular field of study? Acoustic manipulation is rather specialized." Moriarty's eyes gleamed with intellectual engagement, clearly pleased by the question. "It began with mathematics, Mr. Holmes, the study of resonant frequencies and harmonic patterns. From there, it was a natural progression to the physical applications, how sound waves interact with different materials, how structures can be designed to filter and transform auditory input." He gestured toward the mask on the desk. "These artifacts represent the intersection of science and psychology, objective acoustic principles combined with subjective human interpretation." Watson, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned forward with a frown of lingering skepticism. "But surely, Professor, there must be simpler ways to study such phenomena. Laboratory conditions, controlled environments. The scientific method would suggest a more direct approach." Moriarty turned to him with a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Indeed, Doctor, and such studies have their place. But to truly understand how these acoustic principles function in the wild, as it were, how they interact with the complexity of human perception in natural environments, requires a different methodology, field observation, if you will." Lestrade, who had maintained a professional silence throughout much of the explanation, cleared his throat. "Field observation is all well and good, Professor, but deliberately causing distress to unwitting subjects raises certain legal questions, not to mention ethical ones." "Come now, Inspector," Moriarty replied smoothly. "No harm has been done. Quite the contrary. Miss Winters and Mr. Harrington now have complete explanations for phenomena that might otherwise have troubled them indefinitely. Knowledge, after all, is the surest antidote to fear." He turned to address the two subjects of his experiment directly. "You were selected, if I may say, precisely because your backgrounds and temperaments suggested resilience, the capacity to experience uncertainty without succumbing to it completely. A solicitor accustomed to evaluating complex evidence, and a young woman who has demonstrated considerable fortitude in caring for an elderly relative. You are never at risk of any lasting harm. Miss Winters, who had been silently absorbing these explanations, finally spoke. "That may be, Professor, but you cannot know how deeply unsettling it was. The whispers in the night, the sense of an unseen presence. My aunt has been terribly frightened by it all." A flicker of something, perhaps genuine regret, passed across Moriarty's features. "For that I do apologize, Miss Winters. The elderly lady's distress was not part of my intended design. Perhaps, by way of making amends, I might call upon you tomorrow to offer a complete explanation to your aunt as well. The certainty of scientific understanding may help restore her peace of mind." Before she could respond, Holmes interjected, his voice carrying a note of renewed suspicion. "You seem remarkably well informed about Miss Winters' household arrangements, Professor. Just how extensive was your research into your subjects?" A brief silence followed this question, during which Moriarty maintained an expression of a perfect composure. The fire shifted slightly in the grate, sending a soft shower of sparks up the chimney, and momentarily brightening the room with a warm, golden glow that caught the silver in the professor's hair and beard, giving him a strangely otherworldly appearance. "Thorough, Mr. Holmes," he admitted at last. "For an experiment of this nature to yield meaningful results, one must understand the variables involved, the environments in which the artifacts would be placed, the daily routines and temperaments of those who would encounter them, all factors that might influence how the acoustic properties would be perceived and interpreted." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And your selection of this particular evening for your demonstration? The convergence of all parties at Baker Street at this precise time, that suggests a level of orchestration beyond mere acoustic manipulation." Moriarty inclined his head in acknowledgment. "Perceptive, as expected. Yes, the timing was deliberate. The artifacts were designed to intensify their effects over a specific period, culminating in the suggestion of this address on this particular night. Halloween, Mr. Holmes, when the public imagination is already primed for the unusual, when the boundary between the rational and the fanciful seems temporarily permeable." "A theatrical flourish," Holmes observed, his tone neutral, yet somehow pointed. "One might call it that," Moriarty conceded with a slight smile. "Or perhaps an appreciation for context. The same phenomenon observed in different circumstances yields different insights. To see how you would approach apparently supernatural events on a night traditionally associated with such possibilities, that presented a unique opportunity for observation." Throughout this exchange, Watson had been watching both men with growing interest, sensing layers of meaning beneath the surface courtesy. There was something in the way they spoke to each other, a kind of intellectual fencing match, each testing the other's boundaries and capabilities while maintaining perfect civility. It reminded him of chess masters in the opening moves of a game, each maneuver revealing something while concealing much more. The two constables, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uncomfortable. As the hour advanced, and the conversation delved into esoteric realms of acoustics and psychology, they exchanged glances that spoke of duty shifts ending and reports yet to be filed. Lestrade, noting their unease, cleared his throat once more. "Mr. Holmes, if there's nothing further requiring police attention tonight, Perhaps Wilson and Parker might be excused. They've been on duty since early this morning. Holmes turned from his contemplation of Moriarty with a slight start, as if recalled from deep thought. Of course, Inspector, I believe we have established that no crime has been committed here, merely an unusual scientific demonstration. He glanced at Moriarty with an expression that suggested the assessment might still be open to revision. The constables should certainly return to their well-earned rest. The two young officers rose with evident relief, nodding respectfully to the company before making their way to the door. As they departed, something subtle shifted in the room's atmosphere, a lessening of official scrutiny, perhaps, or simply the natural change that comes with the reduction of a gathering's size. The remaining five, Holmes, Watson, Lestrade, Miss Winters, and Harrington, seemed to settle more deeply into their chairs, as if preparing for a more intimate continuation of the strange evening. Moriarty, however, rose to his feet with fluid grace. "I believe I, too, should take my leave," he announced. "The hour grows late, and I have imposed upon your hospitality long enough. The purpose of my visit has been fulfilled, the nature of the artifacts explained, and the mystery resolved to everyone's satisfaction, I trust." He turned to Miss Winters and Harrington with a courteous bow. "Again, my apologies for any distress caused by my experiment. If either of you wishes to discuss the matter further, or requires additional explanation to fully set your minds at ease, my card." He produced two small, elegantly printed calling cards from an inner pocket, offering one to each of them. Miss Winters accepted hers with slight hesitation, while Harrington took his with the automatic courtesy of a man accustomed to professional exchanges. Both appeared uncertain whether to be grateful for the explanation or resentful of their unwitting participation in the professor's research. "And you, Mr. Holmes," Moriarty continued, turning to the detective with an expression of genuine regard. "It has been a genuine pleasure to observe your methods first-hand. Your reputation for rational inquiry in the face of apparently inexplicable phenomena is well deserved. Perhaps we might continue our discussion of acoustic principles at some future date, under more conventional circumstances." Holmes studied the professor for a long moment, his keen gaze taking in details that others might miss. The precise cut of his clothing, the quality of his pocket-watch chain, the subtle calluses on his right hand that spoke of extensive writing, or perhaps laboratory work. "Perhaps," he said at last, his tone neutral, yet not entirely discouraging. "Though I would suggest that any future demonstrations of your research might benefit from more transparent recruitment of subjects." Moriarty acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. "A fair point, well taken." He turned to address the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I bid you good night, and perhaps, given the hour, good morning would be more accurate." With that, he made his way to the door, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man entirely at ease in his surroundings. Holmes followed him to the threshold, maintaining a courteous facade that nevertheless contained an undercurrent of vigilance. The two men exchanged a final nod, a gesture that seemed to carry meanings beyond the simple courtesy of parting, and then Moriarty descended the stairs, his measured tread fading into the quiet of the sleeping house. Holmes remained at the door for a moment after the professor's departure, his expression thoughtful as he listened to the sounds of the front door opening and closing below. When he turned back to the room, there was something new in his manner, a focused intensity that Watson recognized from their most complex cases. "Well," Lestrade said, breaking the silence that had fallen, "that was certainly one of the more unusual encounters I've experienced in my career. A professor conducting acoustic experiments through disguised artifacts distributed across London. It sounds more like one of those sensation novels than police work." Holmes returned to his position by the fireplace, reaching for his pipe as he gathered his thoughts. "Indeed, Inspector, though I suspect we have been presented with only the surface layer of a considerably deeper design." Watson looked up sharply at this. "You don't believe his explanation, Holmes?" "Oh, I believe the technical aspects entirely," Holmes replied as he methodically filled his pipe. "The acoustic principles are sound, if you'll forgive the unintended pun. The mask and its companions are indeed cleverly constructed to transform ambient sounds into whisper-like utterances under specific conditions." He paused to light the pipe, the brief flare of the match illuminating his features in sharp relief. "What I question are the professor's motivations and the full extent of his research." Miss Winters, who had been quietly contemplative since Moriarty's departure, spoke up. "You think there's more to it than scientific curiosity? Some darker purpose?" Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, sending a delicate wreath of smoke toward the ceiling. "I make it a practice, Miss Winters, not to theorize ahead of sufficient data. What I will say is that Professor Moriarty represents a most unusual combination of qualities. Brilliant scientific mind, clearly, but with a willingness to manipulate others that suggests a certain moral flexibility." Harrington, who had been silent throughout much of the later conversation, straightened in his chair. "Are you suggesting we might still be in some danger, Mr. Holmes? From these artifacts, or from the professor himself?" "I think not," Holmes assured him. "Whatever the professor's fuller purposes may be, I believe his immediate objective has indeed been accomplished: the demonstration of his acoustic creations, and the observation of how they are investigated. You and Miss Winters were means to that end, and now that it has been achieved, I suspect his interest in you specifically has concluded." The solicitor nodded, visibly relieved, and slumped back in his chair. The strain of the past days had clearly taken its toll, leaving him exhausted now that the immediate mystery had been resolved. Lestrade checked his pocket watch, his expression suggesting he, too, was feeling the late hour. "Well, Mr. Holmes, unless you believe there's some aspect of this matter that requires official attention, I should probably take my leave as well. Some of us have reports to file in the morning, even after such an unusual night." Holmes nodded. "By all means, Inspector. I believe the immediate concerns have been addressed, though I may call upon you tomorrow if further aspects of the case warrant discussion." As Lestrade rose to depart, Miss Winters and Harrington exchanged glances, seeming to realize for the first time the extreme lateness of the hour, and the awkwardness of their continued presence in a stranger's rooms well past midnight. They, too, began to make motions of departure, gathering coats and expressing somewhat bewildered thanks for the explanations provided, if not for the experiences that had necessitated them. "Mr. Holmes," Miss Winters said as she prepared to leave, "what should we do with these artifacts? The carved box in my aunt's drawing-room, should it be destroyed, or handed over to the authorities?" Holmes considered this for a moment. "I see no need for destruction, Miss Winters. Now that you understand its true nature, the box poses no real threat. It is merely a cleverly designed acoustic device, not unlike a musical instrument. As for the authorities—" He glanced at Lestrade with a slight smile. "I suspect our good inspector has quite enough unusual evidence cluttering Scotland Yard without adding to the collection." Lestrade chuckled despite his fatigue. "Quite right, Mr. Holmes. Though I would suggest, Miss Winters, that if the box continues to cause your aunt distress, there would be no harm in removing it from her sight. Perhaps store it away somewhere until the memory of this strange affair has faded somewhat." Miss Winters nodded her agreement, and with final expressions of gratitude and good night, the three visitors departed, leaving Holmes and Watson alone in the suddenly quiet sitting-room. The fire had burned even lower, its embers casting just enough light to illuminate the familiar contours of their shared space, now returned to its accustomed privacy after the unusual gathering. I'll now write Chapter 7 of The Adventure of the Whispering Mask, with approximately 2,500 words, maintaining the atmospheric sleep story style. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the fog-shrouded windows of 221B Baker Street, bringing with it that peculiar quality of silence that belongs only to the earliest hours of morning in a great city. The night had passed, and with it the strange procession of visitors drawn by the whispering artifacts. What remained was the gentle aftermath of mystery, questions partially answered, explanations that satisfied the immediate concerns while leaving deeper currents unexplored. Holmes sat in his armchair by the dying embers of the fire, his angular profile etched against the growing light, like a figure in a cameo. He had not spoken for nearly half an hour, lost in that profound contemplation that Watson had learned to respect and not disturb. The mask still rested upon the desk, now returned to its glass case, a precaution that seemed almost quaint in the clarifying light of morning, yet somehow appropriate nonetheless. Watson himself had dozed intermittently in his own chair, the extraordinary events of the night having given way to the simple demands of physical fatigue. Now, as consciousness returned fully, he found himself watching his friend with quiet interest, noting the subtle signs that indicated Holmes was not merely thinking, but reaching conclusions. "You're troubled, Holmes," he observed softly, his voice barely disturbing the morning stillness. Holmes turned slightly, acknowledging Watson's perception, with a small nod. "Not troubled precisely," he replied after a moment. "Intrigued, perhaps. Cautious, certainly." "About Professor Moriarty?" "Indeed." Holmes rose and moved to the window, where the emerging day was gradually reclaiming London from the mist and shadows of night. The street below lay quiet and empty, wet cobblestones glistening in the strengthening light. "There is more to our academic visitor than was revealed last night, Watson. Much more." Watson straightened in his chair, falling away completely as he recognized the serious note in his friend's voice. "You suspect some criminal intent behind his experiments?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the awakening city beyond the glass. "I suspect a mind of extraordinary capacity," he said at last, "directed by purposes that may not align with conventional notions of law or ethics. The acoustic artifacts are remarkable in themselves, representing a sophisticated understanding of physics, psychology, and craftsmanship. But they are merely tools, Watson. The question that concerns me is, tools for larger design." He turned from the window, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Consider the level of planning involved in last night's demonstration, the careful selection of subjects, the precise timing of their arrivals at Baker Street, the calculated escalation of effects to ensure they would seek answers on Halloween night specifically. Such orchestration suggests a mind that plans several moves ahead, seeing patterns and possibilities that others might miss. Watson frowned, recalling the distinguished professor with his silver hair and courteous manner. He seemed genuine in his scientific interest, Holmes. His explanations were thorough and convincing. "Oh, quite genuine in that respect," Holmes agreed, moving to the sideboard to pour himself a small glass of water. The simple action seemed to ground him in the ordinary world after the long night of strangeness. His understanding of acoustics and psychological response is undoubtedly profound, but that very brilliance is what gives me pause. Such a mind rarely contents itself with small demonstrations or limited applications of its discoveries. He sipped the water thoughtfully before continuing. "Did you notice, Watson, how well informed he was about each of his subjects? Not merely their names and addresses, but their habits, their relationships, their psychological tendencies, the kind of information that requires careful observation over time." Watson nodded slowly, the implications becoming clearer. "You think the distribution of these artifacts was a test run for something larger? Some form of manipulation or influence on a broader scale?" Holmes set down his glass and moved to the desk, where the mask lay silent in its case. The morning light caught the carved features differently than the firelight had, revealing subtle details of craftsmanship that had been obscured in the nocturnal shadows, the fine grain of the wood, the precision of the carving, the almost imperceptible variations in texture that gave the face its lifelike quality. "It's one possibility," he acknowledged. "These artifacts demonstrate that human perception and behavior can be influenced through carefully designed acoustic stimuli. What began as whispered names evolved into specific instructions. Visit Baker Street, which the subjects followed, despite having no rational reason to do so. It's not difficult to imagine how such technology, refined and expanded, might be applied to other forms of suggestion." He lifted the glass case carefully, setting it aside to examine the mask more directly in the clear morning light. "But there's another aspect that interests me even more, Watson. Of all the destinations in London to which these people might have been directed, they were sent here, to Baker Street, to me. Why? What was the professor really seeking to learn from our interaction?" Watson rose and joined Holmes at the desk, studying the wooden face that had been the catalyst for such an unusual night. In the growing daylight, it seemed less mysterious, more simply an object of remarkable craftsmanship, beautiful in its way, but no longer imbued with the uncanny qualities that the night and their collective expectations had bestowed upon it. "Perhaps exactly what he claimed," Watson suggested. "To observe your methods when confronted with apparently supernatural phenomena. Your reputation for rational inquiry is well established after all." Holmes's lips curved in a small smile. "Perhaps, though I suspect he already knew precisely how I would approach such a mystery. No, Watson, I believe he was assessing something else, measuring my capabilities, my patterns of thought, perhaps even my network of connections." He gestured toward the door, through which Lestrade and the others had departed. "Seeing how I interact with Scotland Yard, how I handle distraught civilians, how quickly I can unravel a deliberately constructed puzzle." A silence fell between them, filled only by the subtle sounds of early morning, the distant clatter of a milk cart on the street below, the first tentative chirps of sparrows in the eaves, the soft creak of the building as it warmed in the strengthening sunlight. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between old friends who understand that some thoughts need space and time to unfold properly. Watson moved to the window, watching as London gradually awakened to the first day of November. The previous night's mist was dissipating, revealing a clear sky that promised a crisp autumn day. All traces of Halloween, that boundary time of masks and mysteries, were fading with the morning light, returning the world to its ordinary rhythms. "What will you do with it?" he asked at last, nodding toward the mask. "Keep it as a souvenir of our Halloween adventure?" Holmes contemplated the artifact for a moment longer before carefully replacing the glass case over it. "I think Inspector Lestrade should have it, actually. Not for Scotland Yard's evidence room, but for his own collection. A reminder that even the most inexplicable phenomena often have rational explanations, if one takes the time to look for them." He moved away from the desk, stretching slightly to ease muscles stiffened by the long night of tension and investigation. "As for Professor Moriarty, I suspect we haven't seen the last of him. A mind of that caliber, with that particular combination of brilliance and moral flexibility, is bound to leave further traces in the currents of London's underworld. When it does, I shall be most interested to observe the patterns that emerge." The morning had advanced enough now that the ordinary sounds of Baker Street were beginning to assert themselves. The rattle of delivery wagons, the calls of street vendors, the varied rhythms of a city returning to its daily business after the brief interlude of Halloween fantasy. These familiar sounds seemed to draw a line beneath the extraordinary events of the night, placing them firmly in the past while opening the door to ordinary daylight concerns. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs heralded her arrival with a breakfast tray, the scent of fresh coffee and toast preceding her into the room. She entered with her usual brisk efficiency, though her expression as she surveyed the dishevelled sitting-room and its clearly unrested occupants carried a mixture of disapproval and resignation. "I've brought you something to eat, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," she announced, setting the tray upon a cleared corner of the table. "Though heaven knows what you gentlemen have been doing all night to leave the room in such a state. And on Halloween, of all nights, I half expected to find you conducted some sort of séance, with all the coming and going of visitors at such unusual hours." Holmes smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Nothing so dramatic, Mrs. Hudson. Merely a consultation that extended rather longer than anticipated. Your breakfast is most welcome, I assure you." The landlady's gaze fell upon the glass-encased mask, and a small frown creased her forehead. "And what's this, then? Some new addition to your collection of oddities?" "A temporary guest only," Holmes assured her. "It will be departing for Inspector Lestrade's care later today." Mrs. Hudson regarded the wooden face with evident disapproval. "Just as well. There's something not quite right about it, if you ask me. Looks as if it's listening to everything we say." With that remarkably perceptive observation, she turned and departed, leaving Holmes and Watson to exchange glances of surprised appreciation. Once again, their landlady had demonstrated the kind of natural intuition that often matched Holmes's more methodical deductions. "Mrs. Hudson would have made an excellent detective," Watson remarked as he poured coffee for them both, the rich aroma filling the room with its familiar, comforting scent. "Indeed?" Holmes agreed, accepting a cup with a grateful nod. Her instincts are frequently sound, particularly regarding character. I sometimes wonder if she sees more clearly by not looking too hard, by allowing impressions to form naturally rather than forcing them through rigid analytical frameworks. He sipped the hot coffee appreciatively, some of the tension of the long night visibly easing from his shoulders as its warmth and stimulation took effect. There's a lesson in that, perhaps. Even the most rational inquiry can benefit from those flashes of intuition that come when we allow our minds to operate beyond the boundaries of pure logic. Watson settled into his chair with his own coffee, feeling the pleasant weight of fatigue that comes after an unusually stimulating experience. Not the heavy exhaustion of ordinary labor, but the satisfied weariness of a mind that has been fully engaged and is now ready for rest. "Are you suggesting, Holmes, that there might be aspects of our Halloween mystery that lie beyond rational explanation after all?" Holmes smiled, a rare expression of open warmth that transformed his usually reserved features. "Not beyond explanation, Watson. Perhaps simply awaiting explanations that we have not yet formulated. The universe is vast and complex, and our understanding of it continues to evolve. What seems mysterious or even supernatural today may be commonplace science tomorrow." He gestured toward the mask in its glass case. "Take our whispering friend there. 100 years ago, such an artifact might have been revered as magical or condemned as diabolical. Today, we understand it as a clever application of acoustic principles and psychological suggestion. 100 years from now, who can say what new understandings might make even our advanced explanations seem quaint and limited?" Watson nodded thoughtfully, appreciating this philosophical side of his friend that emerged only rarely, usually in the quiet aftermath of their more unusual cases. "So you're saying we should maintain an open mind, even while insisting on rigorous evidence?" "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, setting down his empty cup with a satisfied sigh. "Skepticism without curiosity becomes mere cynicism. Curiosity without skepticism leads to credulity. The balance between them, that, I believe, is where true understanding lies." The room had grown fully illuminated now as the morning sun cleared the rooftops of London, sending clear, golden light streaming through the windows. It touched everything with a quality of renewal. The familiar furnishings of their shared rooms, the scientific instruments on Holmes' table, and yes, the mysterious mask that had drawn such an unusual assembly to Baker Street on Halloween night. In this clarifying light, Watson found himself reflecting on the nature of mystery itself, how it simultaneously challenges and enriches the human experience. Some mysteries were meant to be solved, their solutions bringing satisfaction and advancement. Others, perhaps, served a different purpose, reminding us of the boundaries of our knowledge and the vastness of what remained to be discovered. The mask, now peaceful in its glass case, seemed to embody this duality. Its whispers had been explained through science, its purpose revealed through investigation. Yet, something about it, some quality that Mrs. Hudson had intuitively sensed, remained elusive, suggesting depths beyond their current understanding. Holmes rose and moved once more to the window, his tall figure outlined against the morning light as he gazed out at the city, beginning its new day. "I think I shall take a walk, Watson," he announced. "The air will be fresh after the rain, and I find that physical movement often helps to organize my thoughts." Watson nodded, understanding his friend's need for solitude to process the events and implications of their unusual night. "I believe I'll stay here and perhaps catch an hour of proper sleep," he replied, feeling the weight of fatigue more heavily, now that the immediate mystery had been resolved. Holmes turned from the window with a smile of understanding. "An excellent plan. Rest well, my friend. When you wake, we shall put Halloween and its whispers behind us and turn our attention to more ordinary matters." He reached for his coat and hat, then paused at the door. "Though I suspect, Watson, that our encounter with Professor Moriarty will prove to have been merely the opening move in a game of far greater complexity and consequence." With that intriguing prediction, he departed, his footsteps descending the stairs with familiar precision. Watson, left alone in the quiet sitting room, found his gaze drawn once more to the mask in its glass case. The morning sun touched its wooden features, highlighting the fine craftsmanship and the subtle expressions that seemed to shift with changes in the light. For a brief, drowsy moment, as sleep began to claim him, Watson could have sworn he saw the carved lips move slightly, as if forming words too soft to hear. But then his eyes closed, and the impression faded into the gentle tide of approaching dreams. Whether it had been merely a trick of the light, or something more mysterious remained, like so many things in their shared adventures, a question without a definitive answer. Outside, London continued its timeless rhythms, the boundary night of Halloween now firmly behind, the ordinary world reasserting itself with comforting predictability. Yet, within that ordinary world, as Holmes and Watson had discovered time and again, lay mysteries and wonders that required only the right perspective to reveal themselves, some to be solved through rational inquiry, others to be appreciated for the questions they raised, rather than the answers they provided. And somewhere in that vast city, perhaps Professor Moriarty was already planning his next demonstration, his brilliant mind moving, pieces on a chessboard that only he could fully perceive. If so, Baker Street would be ready when the game continued, its famous resident ever vigilant for those whispers that suggested patterns beyond the ordinary, mysteries that beckoned from the shadows of the commonplace. The mask, silent now in its case, seemed to watch over these thoughts with patient interest, its carved features holding secrets that might never be fully revealed. A fitting reminder that even in a world increasingly illuminated by science and reason, some mysteries remained to challenge the imagination and inspire wonder in the human heart. In the quiet of Baker Street, as November the 1st began its orderly progression, the final whisper of Halloween lingered like a half-remembered dream, not frightening, but gently haunting, a reminder of those boundaries where reason meets mystery, and both are enriched by the encounter. That's our story tonight. Are you drifting off beneath the soft skies of Copenhagen, the moonlit calm of Athens, the ocean breeze of Cancun, or the quiet glow of Amsterdam? If this tale brought you calm, like the episode and subscribe for more nights like this. Let the silence wrap around you. Let your dreams wander far and free. Sleep gently now, wherever you are in this wide and wondrous world.